Hey folks, it's Tom, your free will prepper. So I'm playing with my scope and trying to learn more diagnostic stuff and just experimenting. This is what I do while other channels argue about whether Icon or Snap-on is the best socket wrench. I'm trying to learn how to diagnose. So I've been wanting to play with a pressure transducer for a while, and there's no doubt that this Pico set is just a really nice professional setup. Lots of different pressures, it's got all the little adapters. But I got to thinking, like, how could I do this? Because I don't have $1,300 to spend on this. Um, and there's some other channels that have great information on doing this. Ralph's Automotive had a great video. Um, I know Ivan built his own at one time, but I think he finally sold out and got the Pico. This is how I'm going to do my pressure transducer to hook to my little kit. I have an idea as to how I'm going to do this. You guys can follow along and let's see if this thing works. Let's see if we can do it. Okay, so the first thing I did was start looking for different pressure transducers, and there's just any number of them on eBay, and they're all pretty much the same. So if you go into one of these, you'll see that you can see the specs. So we come down here, and I want to go with a 300 PSI one, just because I think that's, most compression isn't going to be over 300, but I have seen some over 200, and I don't think they'll go up as high as 400. So we scroll down here, and it'll tell us a little bit about this pressure transducer. All right, so we come down here to the 300 PSI, and we see that it outputs 0 to 300 PSI, 0.5 volts to 4.5 volts, linear output voltage. Linear means straight line, right? So if you took a half volt and the full voltage output of 4.5 volts, there would be a straight line in between all those that correlates to pressure. So 0 psi is a half a volt, 150 psi is 2.5 volts, and 300 psi is 4.5 volts. And it's got a 1/8 MPT connector, and we see that the red wire on this is going to be 0.5 volts. The black is going to be your ground, and the green is the signal input, or really it's the output from the sensor. And so that's where we're going to actually measure our voltage for our pressure. So this looks pretty straightforward, Now we just have to figure out how do we know what all of the ranges are going to be along that linear line. I'm not a mathematician, so here's how I did that. I'm a mathematician, but I'm pretty good with Excel. So what I want to do is make a chart based off of the voltages that were in here. So we know we have 0 psi outputs a half volt, 150 psi outputs 250 volts, and 4.5 psi or 300 psi outputs 4.5 volts. So we'll start with that. I'm going to do a little chart here, and I'm just going to do each voltage along the way. So 0.5 volts, 1.0 volts, 1.5 volts, 2.0 volts, 2.5 volts, and I think I'm just going to leave these as 1 volt, like that. Okay, and then 3 volts, 3.5 volts, 4.0 volts, and 4.5 volts is our last reading. We know this said it was 0 psi, and we know that this one was 300 psi. Oh, 300. Okay, what I'm going to do is insert a second column here, just because I know I'm going to graph this, and I know how I want my graph to look. So these are just going to be the numbers right here, so that I can graph off the numbers. 3, 3.5, 5, 4, 4.5. Okay. And so if we take every space but 0 here, and we count how many there are, well, we have 9 total, minus the 0 gives us 8 possible values that aren't 0. So now we can take our calculator, and all I did here was you take your 300 psi, right, and you divide this by 8 possibilities, and it's 37.5 for each of these values of psi. So every half volt is 37.5 psi. So now all we have to do is come here and do a formula that says this equals this column plus 37.5, and then we take this formula and we copy it and we just drag it down here, and then we have our PSI ratings. Now you could divide that in half again or whatever and put in 1.25 volts if you want to be a little more fancy with your graph. You can make it as detailed as you want. Now I want to give these some headings, so I'm going to go ahead and just insert a row here, and we're going to call this volts, and we're going to call this PSI. Okay, now I want to go ahead and make a line graph of this. So now I'm just going to highlight what I want to graph. I'm going to go to charts, I'm going to go to line, I'm going to do a line graph. And on my line graph I want to go ahead and add data labels, and then I want to go ahead, click on my line, right click on it, format data series, and I want to do drop lines. And so now we can see everything that's here at 1 volts, 37.5, 7.5, and like you could go ahead and add more columns in here and divide that out further if you want to see. I think this will be enough for me to get a general idea of how much compression a cylinder has. I don't need to know an exact value, but as long as I have some idea, like I'm somewhere around 150, that's all I really need to know. And so now I can just print this out and keep this little chart with me when I'm using this on my oscilloscope. Alright, so I got my little linear pressure transducer. It came with this little connector. I put a little extra heat shrink and some electric tape around here to hold everything together real well, like so. But now I want to use this Lyle. This is a valve hold open hose, so you can put a cylinder at top dead center and then pressurize it with this to take the valve springs out. But it's got it covers two different size spark plugs right there, and I use this with my leak down tester. But I want to find a way to hook this to this, and so I have this Harbor Freight coupler, and it of course doesn't fit this. So if you go to the hardware store, you can get one of these 1/4 inch by 1/8 hex bushings. I found this for a couple dollars, and this is the adapter that we need. Take this out, and then that will screw into this like so, and this will screw onto this. So first thing we got to do is just get these all coated up with some Teflon tape and screwed together nice and tight. I got some Teflon tape. I want to go this way with it if I can. Let's see. Good. Make sure we don't cover up the hole. Alright, and then we'll just put this right in here. And I've just got pliers and a wrench. it is a little bit tighter. Now the same thing for this. So now that can hook on to here. Now what I need is a good solid 5-volt stable voltage, because if the input voltage on this swings up and down, then the readings are going to sway as well. So what I want to do is run it off of its own power source, not off of the battery of the car. Although you could probably work out a stable power source that would stay at 5 volts. And the way to do this is pretty much with the voltage regulator. And for low current designs up to an amp, the LM7805 is just a really good little IC that's cheap and easy to use to do this. And so what you can do is you can input anywhere from 7 volts to 35 volts, and then you have to give it a ground on that center pin, and then it'll output 5 volts. And so the way to build this circuit is really simple, and while you definitely could put that voltage in and get that voltage out, you want to add a couple capacitors to help make this voltage a little bit more stable. And the best way to do that is put a larger capacitor on one side and a smaller capacitor on the other side. Alright, so here's a little simple circuit diagram that I found online, but there's a few things wrong with it. This capacitor right here is going to be either an electrolytic or you could use a tantalum, but it's a non-polarized capacitor. This really isn't going to be necessary, so we're going to omit this. It's 10 microfarad here and the 100 microfarad here I think are good values for my application. However, this should be an electrolytic capacitor, and since this is your output positive voltage here, your positive side of the capacitor would be here. Electrolytics are polarized, and then this one will be your positive here. And basically all this does is if there's any little dips or swings in the voltage here, this just stores a little extra energy right here so that it can keep that voltage steady if there's a sag. And then after the regulation, we just don't need nearly as much. You could use a bigger one, and if there's a little voltage sag here, it'll help keep that regulated. This would be to filter the output just a little bit if there's any ripple in it. This non-polarized. However, I'm not worried about that because I'm going to be using a good 9-volt battery here as a source, which is going to be very steady. This might be necessary if you're going to try to, say, run it off of 12 volts out of a car output where you have a little AC ripple going on to help stabilize this voltage and filter that out. And the other thing that I'm eventually going to do here is just add a basically an LED right here, and then put a resistor in say 200 ohms or so, and put a red LED here for the power, and then I'll put a switch off of this battery voltage right here. Yeah, that's my switch, I guess. But anyway, I'll just have a switch right here to turn the power on and off. I'm not going to worry about these things just yet. I might go ahead and put the wires in for this right now and just twist them together, because eventually I'm going to put this in a project box. But right now I just want to get the proof of concept and see if this is going to work. Alright, so what I have is just this little project board here that we're going to solder everything on. I've got my LM7805 voltage regulator. I've got a 10 microfarad 50 volt capacitor. You can use any voltage. Since this 10 is going on the 5 volt side, you could even use a 16 volt. You really want to go at least double what you would expect your voltage to be, but you can always go higher on voltage. So 50 volt will work fine. I happen to have that one laying around. And then I've also got this one left over from a project from DigiKey that is 100 microfarad 50 volt electrolytic that can go in place right here. And I've got me a 9 volt battery connector to put here, and then I'll have my output voltages. So this ground will be tied together all the way through the circuit. So this will be my 9 volt ground here, it'll be my 5 volt ground down here, and this will also be my signal ground for the sensor. Then I'm going to power the sensor off of this, and then the green wire coming back from the sensor will be the output voltage. So we'll go ahead and break out the soldering iron and start putting this stuff together. The first thing I'm going to do is just solder in my IC here, my actual voltage regulator. Okay. So now I'm just soldering on my little red wire here. Our middle pin here. This will be our ground we're going to solder in here next. Alright, so now I have this 100 microfarad capacitor, and the short lead's going to be your negative on these, and they're almost always marked with the stripe as to which one is the negative. So all I have to do is get that between these 2 points on the 9 volt side in the right polarity. So my long lead's going to go towards the red. Like so. What I'm going to do is move this down a few spaces and just run this up so that I have a nice long spot that I can solder other connections to. What I'm going to do here is just put a little solder on the soldering iron, like so, and then just come down here and try to get this at least soldered into place first. Alright, so now what I got to do is just get this put in with the white stripe towards the ground. We'll just kind of come right over here with it. That'll work. And just a hair overlap. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and solder these in. So now what I'll have with the battery plugged in is this will be my ground for the whole shebang. This will be my 5 volts output, and this will be my 9 volts or whatever voltage I put in, which is going to be 9 volts. And this regulator will regulate that voltage. So now what I have to do is get my wires hooked up for my output voltage. I don't think that this wire is going to be quite long enough to do what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and solder some other wires onto it just to make this long enough to reach down to the engine from whatever little project box I end up mounting this all in. So we'll just solder that in right there. We'll also have what's going to be our signal wire coming out, which I'm going to run back up here, but we won't need it yet to test the power on this guy. So what I'll do for now is just tie a knot in that guy. And then we'll have these 3 wires running down to our sensor. So what we can do maybe is just put a little electrical tape around these every so often for now. Okay, so what I've done is just taken this wire and put some pieces of heat shrink along it to kind of hold this together, and that's where my sensor is going to go. Now as far as my scope inputs, I have these Hantek scope leads. I have extras of them. These are a little shorter than I'd like them to be, but that's Hantek for you. However, I do have some BNC extender cables that I can put on here and use. So I have these right here that I can use when I need to extend a probe, and they're just 3-foot male-female BNCs. So that can go on the end of this cable here to extend it another 3 feet when I need it to. So what I'm going to do is just bring this kind of up together here and trim these edges off, and we'll slide a nice piece of heat shrink that'll go around all this to kind of hold these 2 together down here. So first we'll start by just snipping off these alligator clips. And then I'm going to take a nice, a big piece of heat shrink, the biggest I got, right here, and we'll cut that in half. And then we're just going to slide that up this cable. All the way up to right here. We'll slide these wires in behind. That leaves me plenty of wire to work with to get hooked up in here, and that'll be my signal output. So I'll go ahead and heat shrink this down. And now I have a signal output, and this will be my input. So now we just have to solder these wires from the sensor to the right places on here and heat shrink this and put it all together, all nice and neat. So we're just going to solder these up. So those are all soldered, and we'll just put the heat shrink down on each one of these, like so. And we can just heat shrink those up. And now I have this one bigger piece of heat shrink over here I'll slide up, just to kind of cover this whole little thing, like so. And now I have my sensor input. I'm just going to, in addition, put a little electric tape around this guy, I think, right here and here. Alright, so now I need to hook this yellow wire coming up. This is my signal output from the sensor. It's going to come into my signal input for this Hantek probe wire right here. So these two are going to go together. Alright, so now what I have to do is take this black wire and just solder it down here in the middle to where the ground is, which is a common ground for this whole circuit. And we just need to stick it down here somewhere and make it stick to this middle part. What I'll probably do is just kind of tie this a little wire off to this one with a little nylon strap or something, and just kind of keep these all together like so. Give them some strain relief. Alright, so now what I got here is just my board all kind of done up, ready to go, and then that comes out to this little input from this 3-foot wire here, and then I've got this other 3-foot extension I can plug onto it if I need more room to reach my scope, and then I got a nice long wire that's going to go down to my transducer with this little connector on the end. So what I want to do is just go ahead and power this thing up and see if it puts out the correct voltages everywhere and that everything's working. And I got my little Chinese fluke imitation meter here, and let's put that on voltage, and it's set for DC volts. So I've got some batteries from the Family Squalor, and just measure these and make sure that they're correct. And we see we've got 9.6 volts. So now we're going to plug this in and see if anything smokes. And what we should have is on 2 of our pins, and I don't know which 2 are the power, but we should have 5 volts right here. So let's see. Yeah. Come on. And you see here 5.041 volts, 40, going back and forth between 40 and 41. So that's good. We've got our voltages correct down to here. So now if we plug our sensor in, we should get a reading of a 1/2 volt coming back from the sensor to the center probe on this BNC. So because it's 0.5 volts at 0 psi, and I don't know if it takes into account atmospheric pressure as the default or what, but we'll plug that in and let's see what we get. So we just need to go from our ground, which is the same as the outside of this guy, right? So that'll be our ground, and then we'll come into the center probe and we should see 0.5 volts. If I can get the probes on there tight. It might be just kind of hard to get everything connected just right. And we got 505 millivolts, so that's a 1/2 volt. So that's perfect. And we can probably change, I don't know if we can change the range on this to just be whole volts. It might show it a little better that way. So there's our ground. And there's that. And you can see we have a 1/2 volt there. So that's all perfect. So now we're ready to go actually try this out on the car. Put this in a spark plug hole and give it some cranking and see if it'll work. Alright, so I'm set up here to test this guy out. I've got this pressure transducer hooked into the #1 cylinder. That's of course running back this wire here all the way up to here. I'm going to put my 9-volt battery in there in a minute. Got my oscilloscope here. I did run the extension here, but this would probably reach over here just fine without that, but that's okay. Got my USB hooked up. My Hantek's all set up. The software started. I've got it on a 1/2 volt scale. Really, we wouldn't be able to see all 300 psi on a 1/2 volt scale on here, but I'm not expecting to have 300 psi of compression. So I'll probably move this clear down to the bottom because it should come up a 1/2 volt once we plug it in, because it's a 1/2 volt for 0 psi. So I'll move that right at the bottom and then we'll see what happens. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and hook up my 9-volt battery, and I should get a 0.5 volt. Let's see here. And we do. So it looks like it's actually going halfway through that division. So each one of these is a volt right now, even though, oh, I am set to 1 volt. So let me drop this down to 500 millivolts. And our time division right now is 500 microseconds. We'll see what that does. Let's go ahead and crank it over, and we'll see what happens. All right, we're gonna crank it over here and just see what we see. The digital storage on the Hantek's questionable at best, but we'll see what we can do. We'll hit stop. Let's see if I can play that back. Alright, I had some technical issues here. So we're going to try this again. I didn't have my probe plugged in. I've been playing with the software. So let me make sure started. Stop. Start. So we're running. Let's give it a crank. My battery's pretty spanked here. Let's see what we can do. Alright, now we'll stop. Now we're going to move back. Okay, so I got my sheet here. And one of the things about this Hantek is that I can't figure out how to get it to do more than 4K of stored voltage waveforms. I need a Pico so bad. This Hantek's junk. But that's fine. I'm working with what I got and learning as much as I can with what I got. So what I can see here, if this is my 0.5 volt, so I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know if I can change my trigger on the recorded or my level. Yeah. So what I would see is this would be my 1 volt measurement right here. So we have a 0.5 volt for 0, right? So this is 0 psi right here is a 0.5 volt, 1 volt, 1.5 volts, 2 volts, 2.5 volts, and we're almost halfway there again. So 2.5 volts gives me 150 psi, and so we're probably about 160, 165 psi, which is normal for this engine, especially since it's just been rebuilt. But that's as far as I'm going to take it here. Just to see if this works. But the idea behind this is now I can use a current clamp or just measure the voltage sag on the battery while I do the cranking, and then I would be able to estimate how much compression there is in each cylinder based off of this one, which is we know, and how much the voltage was, and then look at the voltage on the rest. See quickly if you have a low cylinder and estimate the compression for each cylinder. So that's the idea behind this, and that's just a few of the things you can use a pressure transducer for. Plugged exhaust would be another one. So there's all kinds of cool stuff that you can tell with this, and I plan to do more and more, especially if I get a better scope someday. But this is my proof of concept. This works. So I'm going to get a nicer project box and stuff to mount this all in, but pretty sweet. Alright, I'll talk to y'all later. This is Tom, your Frugal Prepper.